I had a comment on one of my videos recently asking me to talk a little bit about sculpting tools. Now this actually seemed like a bit of a good idea because I have mentioned sculpting tools in various of my videos over the years, but I've never done one video directly about them, so I thought it might be useful to talk about some of the tools I commonly use, because I've actually amassed quite a large collection of them by now. So the first bunch I wanted to talk about are these. Now there's a variety of different ones here. But the reason I wanted to talk about these first off is because I got these from a sculpting, or an art shop rather, in London called Tarantes. Now you can get tools like this for a number of places. Amazon do a bunch, which I'll show you in a second. But I wanted to mention these ones specifically. As you can see, there's a variety of different shapes here, and I find myself gravitating to a few of these all the time. This one is probably my main one. Just see if I can get that in focus there. There we go. And I find these two sort of spatula type shapes particularly useful for shaping clay. They've got a hard edge and a sort of a curved edge as well. So I find this is my main tool really for sculpting. I've got a few others here, and some of these I use more than others. This one I find particularly useful. It's got a sort of a spike on it, but obviously that's got a bit of a flat edge, so I find that quite useful for sort of cutting flat edges into things, and also for adding fine detail as well. But the main reason I like these is because they're really decent quality. You can get cheaper types of these in a similar shape, but I found that they tend to be made of a much softer metal, and so it's quite easy to bend them. So if I grab the set that I got from Amazon here, now as you can see there's quite a lot here. I mean literally you can buy a pack of about 15 or so for about, I don't know, 10-15 pounds, something like that. And again, there's nothing wrong with them at all. I mean they're perfectly fine, but I do find myself occasionally bending these when I'm using them. So I think for that reason I do prefer these. So if you can get some sculpting tools from sort of proper art shops, I do recommend it, because I think you'll sort of get what you pay for and get a slightly better quality. I've had these for probably 15-20 years now, and they're still going strong. These ones again, they're perfectly fine, but they do tend to bend a little bit, and there's so many of them that I don't always find myself using them. I mean, to be honest, I'm not even sure exactly what this one is for. So you get some quite unusual shapes. I mean, I'm sure I'll find a use for it at some stage, but nevertheless it's a bit of an odd one. So moving on, I think it's worth mentioning some loop tools. So these are obviously used for carving out chunks of clay, and you can get a variety of sort of pre-made ones, but the ones I find myself using the most are actually ones I've made myself. So this one in particular, what this is a loop of guitar string. I think that's a G string there, and I've just glued it into a piece of brass tubing and fixed that into a wooden handle, and I find myself using this quite a lot. It's really good for sort of taking very small amounts off and sort of refining shapes, so I find that really useful. I've had to replace the end of that a few times because eventually that snaps. So I originally had it soldered in there, but that one broke, so I drilled that out and just put a blob of super glue in there and hit it with some hardener, and that seems to hold it in place quite well. So I find that one really useful. This one here was made for a very particular project, so I needed to be able to cut out some sort of right angled gouges into something, so I made this specifically so I could get a slightly geometric shape to it, so that was quite useful. So again, that's just held in with some epoxy onto a paintbrush handle. So as much as you can buy tools, it's often worth making your own if you need something for a specific purpose, so they're quite useful too. Now, similar to loop tools, and I've spoken about these before, I've got a bunch of rakes here of different types. So what these are, in fact all of these I've made myself, they're various grades of rakes. So some are really rough and others are finer. The idea here is that you can use them to refine shapes. So this one, for example, if I get this focused, there we go, is just some wire wrapped around a triangular shaped piece of metal, and that's really good for sort of doing rough shaping of clay. That sort of allows you to rake it along and sort of get rid of bumps in the clay. So I've increasingly found these to be very useful for smoothing out shapes. So what you do is you use a very rough rake like this one and get the basic shape down, and then you jump back and forth between different grades of tools. So this one is some guitar string. I think in this case this is an E string, which I've just bent to shape. So that's really good for just smoothing things out further. And then finally we come down to, I think this one is a D string, and then you can use that to further smooth things out. So once you've gone down those different grades of rake, you can often find that it's very easy to get a very smooth finish, and that's really useful. So moving on, we have these, which are various sizes of ball-ended tools, and I find these really useful for adding pore detail in, but also for cutting in softer detail as well. These don't have any hard edges to them, so they're quite useful for sort of filling in concave cavities, things like that. So I find those quite useful, and there's different sizes on either end. They were bought from Amazon for about £5–10, so very cheap but very useful. One of the original set of sculpting tools I mentioned as well also has two differently sized balls on the end as well, so again, similar sort of thing, but quite useful. Now for larger grades, what I've actually got are these. And what these are actually metalworking tools. This is a dapping block, as you can see, and these are tools that you would hit with a hammer onto a piece of metal to shape the metal. Now, I had never actually got around to using these for shaping metal, but what they're really useful for is having different size balls for sculpting. So if I need to create a particular hole in something or smooth something out, I can find a exact size tool for that purpose. So those are really useful, and again, you can get these off Amazon as well. So I found myself using these not for their original purpose, but I use them quite frequently when I'm doing sculptures, so worth getting a hold of a set of those as well. And again, they're not that expensive, so worth exploring the sort of things you can use. So now these things, which are silicon topped, dropping a few there, which are silicon tipped sculpting tools. Now again, you can get these on Amazon, and they're not very expensive at all, but the advantage of these is they've got a very soft top to them. So if you really do need to do some very delicate detail or smooth out some details you've already created, these things are really, really useful for that. I don't find myself using the flatter ones so much. I do find that this one is the one I tend to gravitate to the most. I've obviously got two different sizes of this as well, so there's some really big ones there and a medium sized one as well. So yeah, these things are really useful. I don't use them all the time, but I do find myself using them once I get into the really subtle detail to try and sort of smooth things out. So yeah, again, worth getting hold of those. And finally, some things that aren't exactly sculpting tools at all, but something that I do use quite frequently and something that I've started using in recent videos. So first off, some food wrap, or cling film as it's often known, and this stuff's really useful for putting over your sculpture. And what you do is you then sculpt through the cling film, and that has the effect of sort of softening the detail that you're pressing into the clay and leaving you some much smoother edges than you would ordinarily get. So that's quite a useful little thing to use. What I've also found myself using, and you would have seen this in recent videos, is using these, which are reticulated sponges. So they have a texture to them, and they're quite good for smoothing down clay, but also pressing texture detail into the clay. And I find these actually really, really useful, and sort of my new favourite technique for doing sculptures. So those things are really useful, and you can get them in different grades as well, so you can get sort of slightly smoother effects as well. And one thing I should sort of add to this collection as well is this, which I made in a video a while back. And this is a texture stamp. What I did was to take some orange peel and pour some resin into the orange peel to pick up the detail. And so I sometimes use this for sort of pressing into clay and adding some texture into it that way. So this is quite useful. I use this for texturing my skull sculpture, which I did recently. So it's worth sort of making casts of interesting textured things if you find them, because you never know what might be useful in a sculpture. And finally, some spatulas, always useful for sort of smoothing out large pieces of clay if you need to. And there's a few different sizes there. I don't use these particularly often, but if I am doing a larger scale sculpture, as I have done recently, then things like this are actually quite useful, just for smoothing out larger batches of clay or cutting bits off. What you might also find useful is just some blunted blades. It's actually really, really useful to be able to just slice some pieces off a sculpture if needed. So I often save some of these just so they're handy, and just so I can use them on a sculpture if I need to and not risk cutting my finger on a really sharp blade. So it's a good way of using discarded blades that you don't need anymore. I did say and finally, but actually there is one other thing which I often use frequently now, and that's some brushes. So these are just various sized brushes, and I found this quite useful for smoothing down clay. Now for a long time what I would do is use a paintbrush to brush in some spirits or paint thinner to melt the surface of the clay and to smooth it down. But what I've taken to doing recently is just using the brush directly on the clay itself, and that has the effect of sort of very subtly smoothing out the clay as you brush it. So I found these quite useful as well, just for smoothing out the final details of the sculpture. So I think that's it. I mean, to be honest with you, kind of anything can be a sculpting tool if it's the right shape. So although a lot of these are purpose made for that purpose, you never know what might be useful. I mean, just grabbing some of the junk that I've got on my desk here, we've got a sort of a large spring there. You never know when something like that might be useful if you want to cut some sort of channels into a piece of clay. So in a sense, anything can be a sculpting tool. So don't be afraid to just grab something random and give it a go if it looks the right shape. Anyway, I hope that's useful. This is just a quick one, but there's a quick overview of all the tools I use, so I hope that was useful. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.